What's good, Ivy Nation? Welcome to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. I'm Vince. That's Trevor. That's Bryan. And we're back. It's a Tuesday. We've got some fun stuff to talk about today. And we are also going to continue our opponent preview. And later on in the show, we will preview the Navy Midshipmen and what that game looks like and what that team looks like more specifically, not to Notre Dame, but in general. And they have a very interesting story that could unfold this year. And we'll talk about that later on in the show. But we've got some good stuff to talk about when it comes to Notre Dame first. And we are done, guys, with the position previews. And so we are kind of moving into another segment of our pre-camp shows. And as a reminder, camp starts this week. And we'll have plenty of coverage, starting with the start of camp and all of those fun things. But we are kind of counting down here the last couple of shows before that happens. And we are going to get into the big questions and the biggest ones when it comes to Notre Dame as a team, offensively, defensively, and what that looks like and what kind of potential answers that those could be. We're not going to give you a bunch of answers today. Those are questions that we have that we need to get answers about. So we've got some fun stuff in store for you today, and we probably have some questions that you're anticipating, and then maybe a few that you're not. And that's the fun part about listening to the show, fellas. But happy Tuesday to both of you. Are we doing okay? Are we ready to roll, gentlemen?
Dude, I'm so fired up right now. It's not even funny. Just thinking about fall camp and what we're going to see. And of course, I'd always like to have more access, but I'm not even going to let that bother me this year. I'm just excited to see what this team can be. And honestly, guys, follow up on, and this is sort of a bit of a continuation of the show that I had yesterday with Sean, where we talked about, will this team be different than past Notre Dame teams, where you think about the 02 season and how fun it was. And then, the next year was terrible. And you think of 05. And even though, Vince, you and I definitely lived through that 06 season. We were both in our 20s and we're excited about, what's coming. And Trev was like, 5 when Ty Willingham was hired, you know what I mean? So didn't have to live through it quite like we did. He was kind of coming into what were you, Trev, 8 when Charlie Weiss was hired, right? But you look at it and it's that's about when I started being a Notre Dame fan. It was that 8 to 10 age. I don't remember what happened in the Jerry Faust era because I was too young to remember that.
Exactly.
And that's kind of what he went through with the Ty Willingham era. But you had that excitement of the 05 season. And then 06, you're 10-3, but it was a really disappointing 10-3. You had 2-3 blowout losses, just weren't competitive in those games, had some ugly wins. And then, you're in the desert again for a while. Went 5 seasons in the desert after that. And then bam, 2012 happens, and we're okay, Brian Kelly's going to live up to what I hoped he would be at Notre Dame, and 12-0, and they're going to build on that. And then 9-4 the next year with losses to Pitt, and you get smacked at Michigan, and Oklahoma whoops you on your own field and all that kind of stuff. And then 15 happens, and you're all right, they've turned the corner, we're back on track, and then boom, bottoms out at 16. You make the undefeated playoff year in 2018. And so, anyway, you get to all these different things, and it's why is this team going to be different? And there's a lot of optimism that we have that this team is going to be different. Sean and I both said at the end, I think this team is going to be different, and here's why. And just more of the bigger picture things. But what this show is going to look at is, what are the questions that this team has to answer? Some of them we're confident in that they will answer. Some of them maybe we're not as certain as what the answer is going to be, but how these questions get answered is going to tell us so much about whether or not this team builds on last season. And by building, for me, it just means you're an elite team again, whether that's semifinals, finals, or you win it all. It's just are you trending in the right direction and becoming sort of that tier 1 premier team? This is just this is the new normal under Marcus Freeman. Or was this a 1-year hit and then they kind of go back and they look more like they were in 2023? How many of these questions get answered positively is going to tell us how close they get to what the expectations are versus kind of what we've seen from teams in the past. And is Marcus Freeman truly the coach that turns the corner as a program? Last year was a great step, but it's not a whole lot different than what Brian Kelly did in his third year. 12-1, play for the title, get smacked. They were more competitive in this title game. I think there's a lot of reasons to be more excited about the team. But the point is, you now have to go show that you can keep this thing rolling and how these questions get answered. And we're going to have some fun. It's going to be team questions, like bigger picture team questions. And then we'll get into the nitty gritty of offensive defense. Vince tried to lobby for special teams, but we're like, dude, no, we're not doing it. Make your field goals. Don't give up big plays. There, we did the special teams question. But
so simple. It's so easy.
But we're gonna do some team stuff, offense, and then defensive stuff. But I'm excited to get going. And Vince, you know Trev's always ready.
Oh, I know Trev's ready. Right, Trev? Right?
Stay ready, never have to get ready, baby. Let's do this thing.
There we go. That's what I'm talking about. So as Bryan so aptly pointed out, we are going to start with the big questions for the team and what those are, what those look like, why they are big questions, and then we'll move into specifically offense and defense. And so without further ado, let's just jump right into this thing. And you kind of hinted at it a little bit, Bryan, with your intro there, was can this team stay hungry? Will they stay hungry coming out of last year? I mean, they went to the national championship game. They proved a lot of people wrong on the way to that national championship game. A lot of guys returning from that group. Obviously, there's some very important spots that they have to fill, but a lot of those kids are coming back. Can they stay hungry, or are they going to just kind of rest on their laurels and kind of, hey, well, this is the way it's supposed to be. This is how it goes, and we'll just get there again, and it is what it is. I mean, last year's team was incredibly hungry, especially down the stretch in the postseason, and what those postseason games look like. I mean, if that team wasn't hungry last year, they don't get as far as they did. Bottom line, right?
But it's interesting. There was there were some questions about maturity and leadership from last year's team early in the season. But I don't think like the Northern Illinois game was a lack of hunger to be great. It was more of a lack of maturity and focus. I think your point is valid, Vince, because I could come like, no, hold on now. They didn't get hungry till after Northern Illinois. I don't know. I was at the Texas A&M game. It looked like a pretty flippin' hungry football team. I looked like a team that had a point to prove. And I'm optimistic that this is going to be true, but honestly, until we see it, we don't really know. I mean, there's times that I've looked at Notre Dame. I thought the 2016 was going to be hungry. Man, you were this close to beating USC. This team is going to be motivated and focused, and they came out and they just kind of went through the motions against Georgia Tech and had that ugly come from behind victory over UCLA and just never looked like the same team. Never had that same fire, that same swagger that 05 team had, in my opinion. And the 13 team was one that just kind of looked like it was going through the motions. And, the 2019 team was kind of like that. They just kind of looked like they were just kind of going through the motions. Like it really what it came down to, it wasn't that they didn't have a hunger to win. It's that they started reading their press clippings a whole lot. Like, hey, we're pretty good. We were a playoff team last year. Teams are going to fear us. They're going to roll over and die in front of us. And they realize quickly, like, no, they're not. You've got an even bigger bullseye on your chest and back now. And that's really what it comes down to is I'm sure the players would all tell us, oh, yeah, we're hungry. But that really gets determined by what they do during these dog days of fall camp. It tells us by their mentality of, are you going to have a 5th-year, 6-year senior preseason All-American talking about, I didn't know anything about Northern Illinois, and then feeling that way and then admitting that later. I mean, those are things that are going to determine just how hungry this team is, how big of a chip this team has on their shoulder. And the reason I put this first, guys, because I think this is going to then manifest through all the other questions that we have. If this team is motivated and hungry to go out there and say, hey, this isn't just a great season. This is the new normal at Notre Dame. Get used to it and then back it up. Boy, that's what's going to that's what we're looking for. And I think that's at the foundation of all the other things we're going to talk about.
Well, and I think that's important because I don't know, we all know about Marcus Freeman's culture and what he's trying to instill and the foundation that he's trying to lay and all of these different things. But the reality is these kids aren't used to being elite year in and year out. They're just not yet. And that's what they have to do. That's the biggest question for me is that, you framed it as, will they remain hungry? To me, it's very similar to that. It's will they can this be the norm? Can this be the Notre Dame program year in and year out? Can you be elite, or are you just going to be a blip and then you're going to dip off? That kind of a thing. Can you remain elite? Can this be the building of a foundation for a program that is in the top tier in college football year in and year out, right? And I think we can all agree right now, Notre Dame's not in that top tier. They haven't won that national championship. They're knocking on the door, but this is all part of it. It's keeping that hunger and keeping that foundation and keeping all of the things that Marcus Freeman wants his program to be. Can you do that year in and year out?
Right. Because, Trev, there's a difference between saying Notre Dame was a Tier 1 team in 2024 and saying they're a Tier 1 program.
Yes, 100%.
And that's what this year is going to prove.
Well, I mean, look, to put some realism behind what you guys are talking about, not realism, but like real life scenarios. Since the origin of my fandom in 2005, Notre Dame has played for major bowls in back-to-back seasons twice ever. 05 to 06 and 20 to 21. That's it. It's wild. And so that's what is hindering them from being considered that Tier 1 level program. Now, I consider Ohio State a Tier 1 program, but they competed for a national championship in 2014, and then we're making major bowl wins every other year up until last year, where they played for the national championship again and then won it. They played for the national championship in 20, and then we all know everybody ran into the buzzsaw that was Alabama that year, understandably so.
Nobody in 2020 was going to beat that Alabama.
No. And so you look at where Notre Dame is at as a team this year, and I love this question because I separated it into two different buckets. One, can you sustain success? Don't want to hammer that point. You talked on it yesterday in the show with Sean. That was a great segment. We talked about it at the start. Can you avoid the 2013, the 2016, the 2019, and the 2021? Is that possible? Agree on that on all fronts. This also comes down to, how do you handle success? You learned the lesson last year of, we didn't handle success well. We get the big win in week 1, the first of my tenure, when Marcus Freeman was talking about it. And, Northern Illinois gets overlooked. We weren't focused. We weren't mature enough. And we used that lesson to kind of help fuel us for the rest of the season, amongst other things. This year, again, Notre Dame is being talked about as a legitimate title contender, not just by Irish Breakdown and the other, outlets that cover Notre Dame football. There is a consensus between guys like Joel Klatt and Greg McElroy and various writers in PFF and some at ESPN are, hey, this Notre Dame team is put together in a way that they could make another run at the national title. Now, then you also have the people on the other side, like PFF, that say that their odds to win the title are virtually zero, but that is what it is.
Which again, in PFF's defense, that was all based on a simulation machine they have.
Yeah.
I mean, their writers put Notre Dame in the top 10 in both offense and defense nationally. You know what I mean? Which, again, it's like sometimes when something kicks something out to you, you're just like, yeah, this formula sucks. We got to do something different. But the point is valid. I've only seen, what's fascinating, Vince, is I've only seen one person, I can't remember who it was like just some real obscure person like CBS or something like that has not even had Notre Dame in the playoffs this year. And you're shaking your head like, no, but that your reaction is exactly what I'm talking about, though.
Yeah.
There's an expectation that, well, of course they're going to make the playoff. The question is, how deep are they going to go? And my thing is, they got to prove to me that expectation is valid.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's where my optimism comes from when I look at where this Notre Dame football program is under Marcus Freeman. Is there is this expectation that there's a new floor here, but it just making it and being one and done doesn't show us that this team is necessarily bounced back completely, because the 2021 team would have made the playoff as well. Would have been a 5 seed. Probably gets smacked in either the first round or the quarterfinals, the way that team was. But it's just really fascinating to see that's that level of expectation. But now it's like, okay, but I don't want to just make the playoff now. Making the playoff isn't like what it was in 2020 or 2018. It's, do 12 teams make it? It's a different animal now. Can you keep that bar high to the point of, like you said, Vince, become a Tier 1 program? Ohio State's down year in the last 15 years was like an 11-2 season where they lost to Missouri in the Cotton Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
Literally started the season 11-0, beat Notre Dame at Notre Dame, and then all of a sudden you lose to Missouri in the Cotton Bowl, you lose to Michigan and all those type of things. And so I think when I look at that, it's like, okay, that's what a tier 1 team looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Alabama has a 9-4 season, and it's like the world's about to end in Tuscaloosa. Like, that's kind of where you want to be. Like, could you imagine what would happen if Kalen DeBoer would have gone 4-8 in his first year at Alabama? He'd be out the door. But that's the difference here now at Notre Dame is that's or at least that's the expectation. Now we need to see if they can back it up.
No doubt about it. And that's going to be the biggest team-wide question I think that we all have, for this season from a big picture standpoint. Now, specifically, to the 25 season, this is a big one because this has hindered Notre Dame in the past. And I will say one of the best parts of 2024 is how they overcame this particular question. It's, will they be able to avoid the big injuries this season? I mean, the fact that they made it to like, if you would have told me in the preseason all the injuries that Notre Dame was going to sustain, offensive line, defensive line, like in very important pieces of this team, Benjamin Morrison, all of these different things, that they were going to go to the national championship game, I would have said, take off the rose-colored glasses. It's not going to happen. You know what I mean? So they did great last year. Can they avoid it this year, Trev? I think that's a huge question mark going in.
Yeah, two things can be true. What they did last year to overcome the injuries was extremely impressive, and I think it just kind of added to the lore of how we're always going to remember the 2024 season. With that being said, that is not the ideal recipe for success.
Nope.
It's not, all right, how do we lose an All-American corner and an All-American defensive tackle, and how do we lose a projected impact left tackle and have 8 different offensive line combinations throughout the year. Again, I know that, Marcus Freeman and that program from the top down are not sitting down on their big drawing board of, okay, how do we make another run at the title? I guarantee you that's nowhere near the recipe for success. And so there are some injuries that you chalk up to, okay, it's a freak injury. Like we talked about it last week. I believe it was in the mailbag. We were talking about just some of the injuries were like, Billy Schrouth's looked worse than Ashton Craig's, but Ashton Craig was the one that was out for the season. Riley Mills' injury, I still go back to this day and watch it, and it's like, I can't believe he tore his ACL after that. The Ben Morrison thing was just so odd because it was, he was banged up for the Louisville game, and that's kind of where he injured the hip, but then he came back against Stanford, and he was okay, but then, enter Georgia Tech. Leonard Moore takes over as the full-time starter. Avoiding those, while I believe that the depth on this team is stronger than it was a year ago, because now those freshmen that were in the 2 deep are now sophomores or, they're redshirt freshmen who have just that year of experience under their belt. Ideally, they stay away from just the devastating injuries at multiple levels on the offense and defense.
Yeah, I mean, look, Vince, it'd be nice to say, that's just the kind of program Notre Dame is. They can suffer 39, season-ending injuries. Incredibly hyperbolic. You guys get what I'm saying, though. But like, they can lose two starting offensive linemen, and they can, their top tight end can be, hindered all year, and they can lose their, third down running back, and they can lose their starting Viper, and then his replacement 2 games later, and miss one of their standout D tackles, and then their All-American D tackles gets hurt in the first round of the playoff, and they can lose their All-American cornerback, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And make it back to the title game again. No, you can't. And or at least you don't want to try it again. And we said, guys, you have to understand, last year was a unique season. Notre Dame benefited from the fact that, they had great culture, they had great depth and all the positives, but you also were in a year where it wasn't a great season nationally. We told you that before the year, and we'll say it again. They were able to overcome a lot of those things because they're very talented. And they are a very talented and well-coached football team, but they also got the benefit of it not being a really deep season in college football. We can be honest about that, which means in a year where that I don't expect it to be as down, like 2025, you've got to bring – you just can't go through that again. And it's certainly a big year for Lauren Landau because the people I talk to around the program, I haven't always heard great vibes about the strength coaches at Notre Dame. Vince, you know that. You've known me long enough to know some of the stuff I reported about the couple that came before Matt Balis. But I hear things about Lauren Landau that are very similar to some of the things I heard about Matt Balis as far as the results of what we're seeing. Well, now it's time to, have another year where if you just have a lot of those unfortunate injuries, it's just kind of like, okay, you can't possibly have this bad of luck. There's got to be something more to this. So I think it's a big year for him. And if the work that him and his staff are putting in and the results they're getting is what I'm being told they are, then it's like, okay, I don't think we're going to see that issue again. There's always going to be injuries. It's a 16-game season. Somebody's going to hurt a shoulder. Somebody's going to tear their ACL. Something's going to happen. But it's the volume of them that is more of the issue. And then the bad luck part is that they just so happen to be two prominent players all the time. It wasn't like, your backup D tackle went down with a knee injury on a sack late in the half. It's your All-American did. That was the weird thing is it always seemed to be like, okay, another stud. It's not even just like a starter. It's like, oh, another stud. Great. It's like wonderful. This is just super fun that we're going to have to go through this. But, I think this team showed their heart and their talent and good coaching by being able to overcome that. You can't make a habit of that. Just can't.
Agreed. And it's going to be, I can't imagine. I'm not going to say, I'm not going to put it out there. I'm not going to say it out. I'm not going to say it out loud. I'm going to keep it in my head.
Smart man.
We're just going to move on to the next question because I don't want to be that guy.
You're so going to come back and blame you for that too, Vince.
I know.
It would absolutely happen for whatever.
July 29th, 1:26 p.m.
I didn't say it. I don't know.
I'll remember, but you thought it. You thought it, Vince. You thought it.
I didn't come up with the question. Okay. All right. So anyway, let's move on to the next big team question. And it is, will leadership be as good as it was last season? And I think, you mentioned before they went into the last season with some questions about who the leadership was going to be, what was it going to look like, things like that. I think there are other questions going into this season about leadership and who it's going to be, because I think there are a multitude of candidates who could be quote unquote leaders or captains in those kinds of things. So that's going to be a big one, Bryan, is what the leadership is going to be like.
And last year had great leadership eventually. But I don't know that leadership was great at the beginning of the season. I think there were some guys who became great leaders that were still trying to find their way a little bit early in the season. Riley Leonard struggling to maybe be the leader he wanted to be because he's trying to figure out how to read the defense and complete passes. You know what I mean? And certain guys really, Riley Mills going from being a complimentary player the year before to a guy that now is being tasked with being like the stud of the defense. And there just were some guys that I thought struggled to handle that role. Xavier Watts becoming, trying to learn to be a bit of a more vocal leader as opposed to just a by example leader. And then the Northern Illinois game hit and we saw, I think, a question of leadership because there was no answers from an intensity standpoint. I know that we were talking about where's your leadership when coming out of the Miami of Ohio game. And I think that was a bit of a turning point from a leadership standpoint. We saw a very different Notre Dame team come out against Louisville from an energy effort standpoint, and it just maintained really the rest of the year. And the focus wasn't always there. I didn't think they were incredibly focused in the first half against Stanford. I didn't think they were incredibly focused in the first half against Virginia. They weren't incredibly focused in the first half against Florida State, which is going to happen when you're playing a bad team. But the leadership was there, the intensity was there, the energy was there, and then they answered the rough starts in some of those games by rolling teams. Something they did not do against Northern Illinois, and so I think we knew who the leaders were going to be last year, much more so than now. But what kind of leaders will they be is a question mark. Now I think it's a little bit of both. We don't necessarily know who the leaders are. And then how are they going to be? I've heard good things so far, and some of it I talk about in those intel pieces I have on the board. But it's great to be that way in July, but I want to see you be that way at halftime of a game where you're not playing great. And I want to hear about that in the middle of fall camp when, the O-line's dragging for a couple days and Billy Schrouther and Emil Wagner and Ashton Craig is like, we ain't tolerating this. Because, look, I don't care who you are as a coach. You can only take a unit so far. Like, I mean, Joe Rudolph we could be like, man, Joe Rudolph is the best O-line coach in college football. But you can only take that so far. You then have to create a culture in which your player leadership takes you the rest of the way. That was true under Harry Heastan. That was true under, Ed Warner. That was true under Joe Moore. Your player leadership has to take you to that, I'll take you here, but you got to get us to the mountaintop. Does that step up this season? We need to hear those things. And the more that do that, not just for the team, but then at each position group, the more the team is going to be able to handle some of the slings and arrows that comes their way and some of the ups and downs that are just happen to every team in every season.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think it comes down to what type of leadership you're going to get on either side of the ball. As of right now, today, I would say I have a few more questions about it on offense as far as what types of leaders that there are. Defensively, it's not going to surprise me if the first day in fall camp, the two loudest people on the defensive side of the ball that we hear is Drake Bowen and Adon Schuler. From everything that I've heard, the stuff that I saw in the spring, none of that would surprise me at all. On offense, I know they have leadership, but a lot of it strikes me as the Xavier Watts leadership, the lead by example. You hear about that in the player interviews. It's, Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price talk about how they're reserved and quiet and they're humble. And it's kind of, hey, look what I do, and I'm going to set the example. And Jaden Greathouse, for all the great things that we've heard about him from the spring of, he's always the first in line at drills and setting the standard for what that means. Can he take that leadership to a vocal level? How do the transfers impact that? Malachi Fields was a captain last year for Virginia. Does that translate over into South Bend? Now, on the offensive line, you brought up some other players, Emil Wagner, Ashton Craig, Billy Shroud, things that we've heard great things about that are on the intel pieces on the boards. That it's, okay, what does that next level for you guys look like? So on the offensive side, it's not a question of if they have it. I think all three of us are confident that they do. It's a what type of leader will you be? Because you do need a good mix of both. When you have 5 leaders on the offensive side of the ball, but everybody's like hey, just watch me do my thing and just do that. And it's like, okay, that works, but Jeremiah Love, not everybody can hurdle a defender that's standing up fully grown against Northern Illinois and run it in for a 34-yard touchdown. So how do you kind of bring the juice a little bit? How do you – I think a very underrated player that was able to do that for Notre Dame in years past, and I think back to, Nana Osafo-Mensah. He was a big rah-rah leader type of guy. Wasn't a starter, wasn't a – but he was able to get the guys going. Who steps up into that role this year for the offense? I think that's a big question.
I think it should also be noted that Notre Dame was able to add some leadership through the transfer portal. And you mentioned, Trev, that Malachi Fields was a captain for Virginia. Well, so was Will Pauling at Wisconsin. And that's something that we've talked about, like finding some character additions is part of recruiting. And look, there's a lot of reasons you recruit a guy like Adon Schuler or Drake Bowen. Part of it is talent and all this, but part of it is, hey, that guy's you got to be able to identify guys like that through the recruiting process, portal wise and team wise. And I think that's there's a very clear focus on finding character on the recruiting trail. And not that the previous coach didn't do that. I'm just focusing on this coach, which is why I'm a little bit more confident that this is going to take off, because I think, Trev, I actually think there are some guys on the offensive side of the ball that have started to show things that answer your question. Will this guy just be a leader by example, or is he going to be a vocal leader? Which I think not being inside the team is a fair thing to point out. But from what I'm told, guys like Jeremiah Love, guys like CJ Carr, guys like Will Pauling, Jaden Greathouse, Billy Shroud, Ashton Craig have started to say, hey, no, I am going to be that guy that is going to stand in front of the room and be like, nah, this is going to be different. This has got to go. And then there's also the leaders by example. And so I'm more confident in that based on some things I've heard about this team this offseason and some things I've put in those intel reports on the board.
Love it.
Let's get to our next team question, and that is and this one is a very nuts and bolts, black and white, in my opinion. And it's, can they survive September? We've talked about this team a bunch and how arguably the 2 first games of the year are the biggest games of the year. Now, I realize the first game isn't technically in September; it's August 30th.
Well, but see, that's why when I put this question in there, because it's not just about Miami and A&M.
Hit it.
Because it's about the way the schedule shapes up, the way we talk about it being a very top-heavy schedule. Where I think people miss the boat on that is they just assume that we're talking about Miami and Texas A&M. And I think that's part of it, but I also think you've got that game at Arkansas coming up as well in game 4, which is the last game of September. You could say, okay, you lose to Miami, but bounce back with a win over the A&M, or you beat Miami and then you stumble, you lose your third out of 4 years home opener to A&M, and okay, but you can weather that storm. But that Arkansas game to me is looms a little bit large to where coming out of September, are you in a position to then make a run the rest of the way? Which is in two areas, Vince. One is if you're undefeated, then you're in a mode where you can sustain an upset loss to an NC State in October, which is what we've talked about as the trap game. But if you're going into that game with a loss or going into that game with 2 losses, now you're in trouble. And I think that surviving September in that regard, and also surviving September from an injury standpoint, is not suffering a lot of early, because like what hurt them last year, I think, is that so many of those injuries happened early. And it hurt. And when I mean hurt them, I mean part of the reason why they didn't play well in September is because so many of those injuries happened early that, Anthony Knapp being thrust into the starting lineup, right? Early on, you had, Jordan Patelho going down early. You had, Ashton Craig going down early, to where you could just never. Riley Mills is banged up. Josh Burnham gets hurt against Northern Illinois. Like it just, Riley got hurt against Northern Illinois. It's just like right away, you're just like, man, this is not a healthy team. And you wonder why they kind of stumbled early on. Well, then as guys were out and younger players started getting into more of a rhythm, then boom, here you go. You're now rolling. Hopefully this team can kind of have some continuity. And that's the word I was thinking of in my head that I didn't say, is there was never any continuity in September. It was like some new guy being thrust in the lineup. It wasn't until you started to find a little bit of that the team started rolling. So that's the other part of this surviving September thing, Vince. It's the 2 early games, but then also that Arkansas game where, man, you there's a couple just potential stumbling blocks in the early season. You come out of September, no losses, relatively healthy. This team, I think, rolls. Even if you have 1 loss, but they've bounced back and there's some continuity, then you feel good going into that stretch of October that starts hot with Boise and then, NC State and USC. And so that's where I meant for that one, is can you survive that month in a way that they didn't last year? Now they overcame it, but it put them behind the 8 ball all year. And you just don't necessarily.
Well, it made him in a win now scenario for the rest of the season, right? I mean, that's what it came down to, right?
Well, I mean, when you look at the schedule, big picture, you could make the argument that their 2 biggest road games are before you hit October. You're on the road against Miami, and then you're on the road against Arkansas. I mean, depends on how Pitt season goes. That could be a big road game down the stretch.
I don't think you need to. I don't think you need to even justify it, Trev, because these games, because they come first.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, from a perception standpoint, I don't care if Pitt's 9-3 and Arkansas 7-5. That road SEC win, from a perception standpoint, which matters to voters and things like that, is going to be more impressive than an 8-4, 9-3 ACC team.
Yeah,
all day long.
It just is
all day long.
So I don't even think you need to justify it with, well, maybe this, maybe that. Unless Pitt's an undefeated or 1-loss team, I don't. Same with BC, and I don't see there being a bigger road game than those 2. I think you're absolutely spot on.
And that just adds to the magnitude of the meaning of the month of September. When you sent me over the outline, I love this question because I didn't even think about the month of September in its entirety. I just thought of like the first, essentially half of the season. It's like, gosh, in one half of the season, essentially all before your final bye week, you got, Texas A&M and Miami and Arkansas on the road and Boise State at home. You play 2 programs back to back for the first time in your program's history. One of them's on the road in the SEC. Then you round it out with the USC rivalry game. And, more times than not, that game is always close. It's a rivalry game, And so I loved seeing that when the outline got sent over. But the month of September is going to be huge. You have your 2 biggest games of the season on the schedule in back-to-back games. And then you have your 2 biggest road wins on the schedule in that time frame as well. September is going to be huge.
Because I would argue the most devastating game of September was not Northern Illinois. I think they overcame that loss. The most devastating game of September last year was Purdue.
Yeah.
They won by 59, but they
from
lost
an injury standpoint.
Telho, they lost Ashton Craig. You know what I mean? Like, that's part of what I mean by surviving September.
Yeah.
You won 59. I think we even said that. Like, this is a very costly victory at the time because you lost Patelho. You knew he was done. You thought that Schrouth was done. You weren't sure about Craig. It ended up being the reverse. that it was actually Craig that was done, Shrouth, and there was other things that came out of, Cooper Flanagan was never the same player after he hurt himself, reaching for a poorly thrown ball against Miami of Ohio, which also happened in September. So there just were these. Christian Gray was never the same player after that hand injury, which happened in September. So September was a really devastating month for Notre Dame in a lot of ways that kept them from reaching their full potential. It's a testament to this program, the talent, the coaching, the heart of the players and all that they still went on the run. But boy, it was really hard. It made it hard on them. You just want to have a little bit of a cleaner path in that regard. And that's why I think September is so important.
Makes a lot of sense. And that kind of leads us into our next big question, our final big question for the team as a whole. And this one is an interesting one to me because, obviously people are going to watch our shows and listen to our podcast because of what we see with this team and our the way we analyze things and all of those deals. And, at the end of the day, is this team as talented as we think it is? And the only way to really know that is to watch the games and to, see what they end up doing in the month of September and beyond and how they overcome injuries and all of those different things. Are they who we think they are? I think that's a question for every year, but, specifically for this year, we think this is one of the deepest, most talented rosters Notre Dame's had in a really long time. Are they that?
And Trev, wouldn't you say that it's even more of a question now than maybe it will be in a couple of years when they are more established as a consistently good program? I mean, I think that's kind of where I'm coming from on this.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I'll be real. This is the one question that keeps me up at night. Hyperbolically, I sleep pretty well, but I mean, at the end, but
until he falls asleep, this is what he's thinking about.
Yeah. But legitimately, we brought up a lot of past teams that kind of didn't live up to expectations, but they had talent on the roster. That is the one pause. Now, arguments could be made about the depth of talent and who they had where, and yes, they would have a Jalen Smith, but then starting alongside him would be a Joe Schmidt, not a Drake Bowen or a KVA, and all those points are valid. But the one thing that some of those teams didn't like 2011 didn't lack talent; they underperformed. 2013 didn't lack talent. 2015 didn't lack talent. 2021 or 2019, they didn't lack talent. But at the end of the year, we were sitting back. It's like, what happened to the talent? There's all these expectations. Man, like we're painting all these pictures. And I have a lot of good backline conversations with Bryan and Vince and both Sean's. And then, friends in my friend group who are also Notre Dame fans, like, man, like you paint the picture of how do you stop this offense? How do you stop a Malachi Fields and Eli Raridan with Jeremiah Love? How do you throw on Leonard Moore and Christian Gray with, Jason Onye and Boubacar and Bryce Young coming after you? You could have made those arguments about a lot of the other teams that I listed as well. How do you stop a Will Fuller, CJ Prosise, Malik Zaire offense? And how are you going to throw on a defense with, Isaac Rochelle and Jalen Smith and Kavari Russell and Max Redfield on it? And then
here's your answer: hire Brian Van Gorder.
Yeah, I was about to say that's a very easy.
Sorry.
That's a very easy answer.
Sorry,
but that wouldn't have been on our list of questions in the preseason. But point being, talent was never the question at the top. Depth of talent is different, but is it what we think it is? That's a great question.
Yeah. I again, this is one of those ones I believe is going to be a positive, but until they see it, like, was last year a byproduct of it being a down year in college football? Do they really have a roster that's as good as Ohio State's and Penn State? Well, we know it's Penn State's, but like, is it as good as Texas? Are they athletic enough to play with Oregon and all those different things? And so I look at it, guys. That's where I'm at. Is I think this is a really talented team. And it'll be nice to see it manifest again. And it's going to need to do it this year, because again, as we've said, it's a much more challenging season. It's going to make the run they did last year. If they get back to the place they were a year ago, which is the national title game, it will have been an even greater accomplishment in regard to yes, you had to overcome a lot, but as far as the quality of the opposition you had to overcome, it'll be tougher, not just in the regular season, but also in the postseason. And you're going to need to be as talented as we think they are for that run to happen.